On the night of June the 30th, 2026, a single envelope was placed on a desk inside the Apostolic Palace. Inside that envelope was a letter. 3 paragraphs, no greeting, no pleasantries, just a papal decree that ended a man's entire career in the Catholic Church. The recipient was one of the most powerful cardinals in Rome, and by morning he would have nothing left but a title stripped bare. That letter would shake the Vatican to its foundation, and what happened in the hours that followed was something no one inside those ancient walls had ever seen before. But here's the part nobody expected. The cardinal didn't go quietly. He fought back, and what he revealed in his defense nearly brought down something even bigger than himself. Now, before we go any further, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. These stories take serious research to put together, and your support makes it possible. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get back to it. His name was Cardinal Augusto Ferrante, 73 years old, Italian-born, a man who had spent 4 decades climbing the ranks of the Roman Curia with the patience of a chess grandmaster and the instincts of a street politician. He had served under 3 popes. He had survived every reform, every investigation, every scandal that had swept through Vatican City for the past 2 decades. He had outlasted men younger, smarter, and more ambitious than himself, not by being better, but by being more careful. He knew where every document was filed. He knew which Monsignor owed what favour to which archbishop. He had a memory like a vault, and the temperament of a man who had never once been surprised by anything. He had been untouchable until now. Ferrante controlled the dicastery for the clergy. In practical terms, that meant he held influence over every priest assignment in every diocese across Europe and Latin America. He decided who got promoted, who got transferred, who got buried in some forgotten parish on the edge of nowhere. For years, that power had made him one of the most feared men in the church. Bishops didn't cross him. Archbishops called his office before making any major decision about their own personnel, and even some of the other cardinals, men who technically held equal rank, treated him with the kind of deference usually reserved for the Pope himself. He had built an empire inside an empire, invisible to outsiders, impenetrable to reformers, and completely dependent on one thing: the assumption that no Pope would ever have the will to tear it down. But Pope Leo XIV was not like the men who came before him. Robert Francis Prevost had taken the chair of St. Peter on May 8, 2025, just 17 days after the death of Pope Francis. He was American-born, the first American pope in history, an Augustinian friar, a trained canon lawyer, a former math major who had spent years serving in Peru before being called to Rome. He was quiet but precise, calm but relentless. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply moved pieces on the board until the board looked completely different, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. From his very first week in office, he had made one thing abundantly clear to every member of the Curia: the old way of doing things was over. Leo had spent his first year laying the groundwork, reshuffling Vatican finances, overhauling the governance of the Diocese of Rome, holding 2 extraordinary consistories of cardinals, something that hadn't happened in back-to-back years in modern memory. He had replaced key officials, appointed women to senior dicastery positions for the first time, including Sister Alessandra Smerilli as prefect of the dicastery for integral human development. He had strengthened the Vatican's financial watchdog agency with sweeping new transparency statutes. He had signed a motu proprio restructuring the entire Vicariate of Rome, replacing the provisions put in place by Pope Francis. All of it had been done quietly, methodically, without the theatrical confrontations that marked previous papacies. One Vatican journalist described Leo's governing style as a scalpel, not a hammer. He never made a move without having already secured the legal, canonical, and institutional foundation to support it. But this move, the move against Ferrante, was different. This one was personal, and what happened behind closed doors in the weeks leading up to that letter was more dramatic than anything that made the public record. The trouble had started 3 months earlier, in late March, when an internal audit flagged a series of irregular financial transfers within the dicastery for the clergy. The amounts weren't massive, about €2.4 million spread across several accounts in multiple countries. But the pattern was unmistakable. Funds earmarked for seminary programs in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia had been redirected, rerouted through intermediary accounts in Switzerland and Luxembourg, layered through shell entities that appeared to exist for no purpose other than moving money, and the authorization codes on every single transfer traced back to one office, Ferrante's office. When the initial findings landed on the desk of the Vatican's supervisory authority, the newly reformed financial watchdog that Leo had just overhauled with a comprehensive new statute. The team flagged it immediately. Francis Poli, the newly appointed president of the supervisory board, escalated the report within 48 hours. It was fast, efficient, exactly the kind of institutional response Leo had been building toward, with every reform he had signed. But what happened next slowed everything down, because Ferrante had allies, powerful ones, and they weren't going to let this go without a fight. At least a dozen senior clerics inside the Curia owed their positions directly to Ferrante. He had placed them there over the course of 15 years, carefully, strategically, always with an eye toward building a network that could protect him if the day ever came. 3 of those men sat on oversight committees that would normally review cases like this. 2 of them, Archbishop Enrico Salvi and Bishop Marco Dell'Oce, began quietly pushing back against the investigation before it even formally began. They argued process, jurisdiction, canonical precedent. They said the audit methodology was flawed, that the transfers had been approved through proper channels, that the funds had been redirected temporarily due to banking restrictions in the recipient countries, and that all monies had eventually reached their intended destination. On paper, their arguments were reasonable. Technically, some of them even had merit. But behind closed doors, everyone knew what they were really doing. They were buying time. But here's what they didn't understand about Pope Leo XIV. He doesn't wait. On April 14th, the same week he returned from his historic trip to 4 African nations, Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea, Leo called a private meeting in his study inside the Domus Sanctae Marthae. Only 4 people were present: Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State, Sister Raffaella Petrini, the Secretary General of the Governorate, a representative from the IOR, and one other person whose identity has never been officially confirmed, though multiple Vatican insiders believe it was a senior investigator from the Promoter of Justice's office. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. No notes were taken, no official summary was produced. But what emerged from that room was a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire pontificate. Leo authorised a full canonical investigation into Ferrante's financial activities going back 5 years. Not 3 months, 5 years. That decision changed everything. Because when investigators started digging deeper, they didn't just find financial irregularities. They found a system, something far worse. They found a system. Internal Vatican documents would later describe it as institutional manipulation of clerical assignments for personal and political benefit. In plain language, Ferrante had been running a patronage network, a shadow government inside the government of the Church. For years, possibly more than a decade, he had been using his control over priest assignments to reward loyalty and punish dissent. Bishops who cooperated with his agenda got favourable postings for their best priests. Those who didn't found their men transferred to remote parishes with no explanation and no recourse. Seminary rectors who raised concerns about Ferrante's interference were quietly replaced. Diocesan administrators who asked too many questions found their budgets cut or their communications with Rome unanswered for months. And at least 2 whistleblowers, a Monsignor in Milan and a diocesan administrator in Sao Paulo, had filed formal complaints through church channels years earlier, only to see their complaints vanish without any record of follow-up. The investigators found those complaints buried in archive files that had been physically moved to a storage facility outside Rome. The paper trail was incomplete. Pages were missing, dates had been altered, filing numbers didn't match, but it was enough, more than enough. When Pope Leo received the interim report in late May, he read it alone in his study. Every page, every appendix, every redacted name. It took him 3 hours. Then he called Parolin. "This isn't corruption," Leo said quietly. "This is a system, and systems don't build themselves." Parolin reportedly tried to counsel patience. He was a diplomat by training and by temperament. He suggested a private conversation with Ferrante, a chance for him to resign quietly with his dignity intact, a chance to avoid a public scandal that could damage the Church's credibility during an already turbulent period. With the SSPX crisis building toward its inevitable climax and the American Eucharistic pilgrimage drawing worldwide attention, Leo listened. He always listens. That's one of the things that makes people underestimate him. They mistake his patience for hesitation, his silence for uncertainty. Then he said, "No, dignity is not a shield for those who have weaponized their authority against the people they were supposed to serve." Leo told Parolin, "If we handle this privately, we send the same message we have always sent. That power protects itself, that nothing ever really changes, that the men at the top are governed by different rules than the men at the bottom." He paused. "Something is going to change. But what happened over the next 4 weeks tested even Leo's resolve. Because Ferrante, it turned out, was not going to make this easy. He was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was the kind of man who, when cornered, became more dangerous somehow. And the Vatican's internal security team has still not determined exactly how Ferrante learned about the investigation before the final report was delivered. Some suspect a leak from the Oversight Committee. Others point to the sheer number of people who had been interviewed as part of the expanded inquiry. Whatever the source, by early June, Ferrante knew, and he began his counteroffensive immediately. He reached out to sympathetic journalists in the Italian media. He contacted conservative Catholic networks in the United States and Europe. He called in favours with Catholic commentators who had platforms and audiences, and he framed the investigation as a political attack, a reformist pope targeting a defender of tradition, an American outsider dismantling Italian institutions he didn't understand. And it worked, at least partially. By mid-June, several prominent Catholic commentators were publicly questioning whether Leo was overreaching. Opinion pieces appeared in Catholic publications suggesting the Pope was weaponizing transparency to consolidate personal power. A former Vatican official, widely believed to be acting on Ferrante's behalf, gave an anonymous interview to a Roman newspaper, claiming the investigation was ideologically motivated and lacked proper canonical foundation. The narrative was spreading across social media. Catholic bloggers were taking sides, and the Italian press was running headlines that made the Pope look like the aggressor. Ferrante was positioning himself as a martyr. And for a few weeks, the strategy seemed to be working. But he made one critical mistake during the extraordinary consistory of cardinals on June 26th and 27th, the second such meeting Leo had convened that year. This one focused on Vatican governance and the Church's response to global conflict. Ferrante attempted to rally support among his fellow cardinals. He approached at least 7 of them individually during breaks in the formal sessions. He urged them to sign a letter requesting that the Pope suspend the investigation pending an independent review by a panel of canon lawyers, chosen by the College of Cardinals itself. 3 cardinals agreed, 4 refused, and one of those 4 went directly to the Pope and told him everything. The identity of that cardinal has never been publicly revealed, but his report confirmed something Leo had long suspected, that Ferrante's network extended beyond financial misconduct. It was an organised structure, a web of mutual obligation and enforced silence, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, something more mundane and therefore more dangerous. A culture, a way of operating that had persisted through multiple pontificates, hidden in plain sight, behind the bureaucratic machinery of the Curia. For Pope Leo, that was the line. Not the money, not the patronage, the culture. The idea that the Church's own institutional machinery could be hijacked by men who treated sacred responsibility as a tool for personal power, and that this could happen openly over decades, with the tacit knowledge of dozens of senior officials who chose silence over accountability. That was what moved him to act. On the morning of June 30th, the same day he signed a sweeping reform of the Vatican's financial supervisory authority and the motu proprio restructuring the Vicariate of Rome, Leo drafted the letter himself. He didn't delegate it to Parolin. He didn't run it through the Secretariat of State. He wrote it by hand, in Italian, sitting at the small wooden desk he prefers to the larger ceremonial one. 3 paragraphs, direct, unambiguous. The letter informed Cardinal Augusto Ferrante that by papal decree he was being stripped of all curial responsibilities, effective immediately. His faculties within the dicastery for the clergy were revoked. His voting rights within the College of Cardinals were suspended, pending the conclusion of the canonical investigation. And, most significantly, his title of cardinal was placed under formal review, a procedural step that, while not an immediate removal, signalled clearly that Leo was prepared to take the extraordinary step of revoking the red hat entirely. In the entire history of the modern papacy, only a handful of cardinals have ever been stripped of their rank. It happened under Pope Francis when Theodore McCarrick was laicized in 2019. But that case involved criminal allegations of sexual abuse. This was different. This was a pope telling the world that political corruption, the systematic abuse of institutional power for personal gain, was just as disqualifying as any other crime in the eyes of the Church. The letter was delivered to Ferrante's residence inside Vatican City at 9:45 that evening by the papal nuncio assigned to internal affairs. By 10:15, every bishop in Rome knew, and every single one of them went quiet. Not because they were afraid, not exactly, but because they understood what this moment represented. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was not a warning shot fired to make headlines and then forgotten. This was a sitting pope, barely 14 months into his pontificate, publicly dismantling the power structure that had protected men like Ferrante for decades. And he was doing it on the same day he had already signed 2 other major reform decrees, as if removing a cardinal was just another item on his agenda for a Tuesday. That composure, that calm, steady, almost surgical precision, that was pure Leo. The reaction inside the Vatican was immediate and deeply divided. Ferrante's allies were stunned. Archbishop Salvi, who had led the effort to slow the investigation in its early stages, reportedly cancelled all his meetings the following morning and was seen leaving Vatican City in a private car before noon. He told his secretary he was going to visit family in Umbria. He did not say when he would return. Bishop Delos released a brief written statement expressing deep concern about due process and canonical integrity, but conspicuously avoided defending Ferrante by name or challenging the Pope's authority to act. The 3 cardinals who had agreed to sign the protest letter quietly withdrew their support within hours. None of them issued public statements. None of them returned Ferrante's calls. One of them later told a colleague, in a conversation that was eventually relayed to Vatican journalists, "The ground shifted overnight. It's not the same church it was yesterday." But the reaction wasn't uniformly fearful. Among younger clergy and reform-minded bishops, men who had spent years watching the Curia operate like a closed system that rewarded loyalty over competence, the mood was something closer to cautious, almost disbelieving hope. A Monsignor who works in the Secretariat of State, speaking on strict condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere as electric but calm, like the air after a thunderstorm. He said people had been waiting for this, not for Ferrante specifically, but for this kind of clarity, for a pope who treats accountability as a principle, not a slogan you put in a document and then forget. And then came July 1st, the same day the Society of St. Pius X was consecrating 4 bishops without papal approval in a meadow in Econ, Switzerland. Before 15,000 faithful, defying the Pope's personal appeal, Leo was dealing with the fallout of the Ferrante decision inside the Vatican. 2 crises, 2 fronts, both challenging his authority in fundamentally different ways. The SSPX was challenging him from the outside, a traditionalist movement that rejected Vatican II and believed it alone upheld Catholic truth. Their defiance was theological, ideological, rooted in a 50-year disagreement about what the church should be. Ferrante was challenging him from the inside, a man who didn't disagree with the church's theology at all. He simply believed the church's rules didn't apply to him. And Leo was handling both simultaneously, with the same measured intensity, without raising his voice. That morning, Leo held a brief meeting with Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. The meeting had been scheduled weeks earlier to discuss the Vatican's response to the SSPX consecrations. But according to sources close to the prefect, Leo spent the first 10 minutes asking about Ferrante's response to the letter. Fernandez told him Ferrante had not responded formally, but he had made calls, dozens of them, throughout the night and into the early morning, to cardinals, to journalists, to canon lawyers in Rome, Milan and Madrid. Leo nodded slowly. "Let him call," he said. "Calls don't change facts." Then he turned to the SSPX matter, and within 24 hours, the Vatican would declare the Society of St. Pius X in formal schism and excommunicate its bishops, priests and adhering lay faithful, the strongest penalty the Catholic Church can impose. Cardinal Fernandez issued the decree on July 2nd, the morning after the consecrations. It went further than most observers had expected, declaring all SSPX sacraments illicit and rolling back years of accommodation. 2 seismic actions in 2 days. From a pope the world had expected to be cautious, incremental, measured. But Leo was never cautious. He was patient. There's a difference. Caution is about avoiding risk. Patience is about choosing the right moment to act. And when that moment arrived, when the evidence was clear, the legal foundation was solid, and the institutional support was in place, Leo didn't hesitate for a second. Ferrante, meanwhile, did not stay silent for long. On the afternoon of July 1st, while the world's cameras were focused on Econ, he released a 4-page written statement through a canon lawyer based in Milan. The statement did not deny the financial transfers. It did not deny the patronage allegations directly. Instead, it mounted a legal and political defence that was clearly designed for an audience beyond the Vatican walls. It argued that the Pope had exceeded his canonical authority, that the procedure used to suspend his voting rights was unprecedented and therefore invalid, that the investigation itself had been tainted by political motivations rooted in an ideological agenda, and it invoked a phrase that sent shockwaves through every office in the Curia. Ferrante wrote, that the current pontificate was pursuing a path of institutional deconstruction that threatens the very identity of the Church. He compared Leo's reforms to a corporate restructuring that treats sacred offices as disposable assets, and he concluded by calling on every cardinal of conscience to resist what he termed an unprecedented concentration of papal authority that substitutes governance for control. That last phrase, unprecedented concentration of papal authority, was read inside the Vatican as a direct challenge, not just to Leo's decisions, but to the legitimacy of the papal office itself. In canonical terms, it bordered on an accusation that the Pope was acting ultra vires. And in the Catholic Church, where the Pope's supreme jurisdiction over the universal Church is a matter of defined doctrine, that kind of language changes everything. Within hours, the tide turned completely. 3 more cardinals, who had previously remained neutral, publicly expressed their support for the Pope's decision. Cardinal Parolin issued a rare statement, unusual for a man who prizes diplomatic silence, affirming that the Holy Father's actions are grounded in canonical law, institutional integrity, and pastoral responsibility for the entire people of God. And the promoter of Justice's office announced that the canonical investigation would be expanded to include any officials who had actively obstructed or delayed the original audit. Ferrante was suddenly completely, utterly alone. On the morning of July 2nd, as the Vatican was issuing its formal decree of excommunication against the SSPX, a quieter document was being circulated through internal channels. It was a summary of the expanded investigation into Ferrante's network, and it contained names, not just Salvi and Delote, but at least 9 other clerics across 3 countries, Italy, Brazil and Spain, who had benefited from or actively participated in the patronage system. Seminary assignments that had been altered, budget allocations that had been diverted, complaints that had been buried, a pattern that stretched back at least 7 years, possibly longer. The document was classified, but its existence leaked almost immediately. Within hours, excerpts were being discussed in whispered conversations in Vatican corridors, Roman restaurants, and encrypted messaging groups used by Catholic journalists. And the effect was devastating, because suddenly this wasn't about one cardinal. This was about a structure, a web, a way of operating that had persisted through multiple pontificates, hidden in plain sight behind the bureaucratic machinery of the Roman Curia. And the question that hung over everything, the question that every bishop and cardinal and monsignor in Rome was now asking themselves, was terrifyingly simple. Who else? Who else had participated? Who else had looked the other way? Who else had benefited from a system that treated sacred responsibilities as currency? One veteran Vatican journalist described it as the moment the curtain was pulled back. He said, "Everyone knew these networks existed. Everyone. The patronage, the favours, the phone calls. It's been part of the Curia for generations. But knowing it and seeing it documented, with names, dates, transfer records, assignment histories, that's a different thing entirely." That's the kind of thing that doesn't go back in the box. Pope Leo, characteristically, said very little publicly. He celebrated Mass that morning in the chapel of the Domus Sancta Martha, as he does most mornings. He met with the papal nuncio to Switzerland to discuss the SSPX fallout and the practical implications of the excommunication decree. He reviewed preparations for his upcoming trip to Lampedusa, scheduled for July 4th, where he would celebrate Mass on the island that had become a symbol of the migrant crisis. But those close to him say he spent an unusual amount of time that afternoon alone in his study, reading, not the Ferrante files. He had already read those cover to cover. He was reading letters, dozens of them, from priests and laypeople around the world who had somehow already heard about the Ferrante decision and written to express their support. Letters from Africa, from Latin America, from the Philippines, from small parishes in rural Europe. One letter from a parish priest reportedly moved him deeply. The priest wrote about serving in a diocese, where assignments had long been controlled by political favouritism rather than pastoral need. He described watching younger priests lose faith, not in God, but in the institution that was supposed to serve God's mission. "We hear words about reform all the time," the priest wrote, "but we have learned not to believe them. This time feels different. Please let it be different." Leo put the letter down and sat quietly for several minutes. Then he called his secretary and asked him to schedule a meeting with the heads of every dicastery in the Roman Curia, all of them, for the following week. The agenda had one item: accountability. When word of that meeting reached the broader Vatican community, the reaction was unmistakable. Something had shifted, not just in policy or personnel, but in atmosphere, in expectation, in the fundamental understanding of what was possible. For decades, the unspoken rule inside the Curia had been simple: survive. Align yourself with the right patrons. Keep your head down during investigations. Wait for the storm to pass. The storm always passed. Popes got old, popes got tired, popes died. And the machinery kept turning the same way it always had. But this storm wasn't passing. This pope wasn't tired. He was 70 years old, and he moved through the Vatican's bureaucracy with the focus of a man who understood exactly how much time he had, and exactly how he intended to use it. He was the storm. And yet, even as the Ferrante situation dominated internal conversations, Leo never lost sight of the bigger picture. On July the 3rd, he finalised his remarks for the Liberty Medal acceptance, a speech he would deliver via video to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia on July 4th, the 250th anniversary of American independence. In that speech, he would reflect on freedom, conscience, and the moral obligations that accompany both. He would ask Americans to recommit to the ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. He would speak about life, liberty, and the protection of the vulnerable. But insiders say he added a passage that wasn't in the original draft. A passage about institutional accountability, about the difference between authority and power, about how true leadership is measured not by what you protect, but by what you're willing to dismantle when it no longer serves the people it was built for. The moral greatness of a nation or a church, he would say, is manifested above all in its capacity to support, protect, and cherish the lives of all, especially the most vulnerable and those whose worth is questioned. He didn't mention Ferrante by name. He didn't need to. Everyone who heard those words knew exactly who he was thinking about. Back in Rome, Ferrante remained inside his Vatican residence. He had not appeared publicly since the letter was delivered. His canon lawyer continued to issue statements, but the tone had shifted dramatically. The aggressive legal challenges had been replaced by quieter language, references to dialogue, pastoral sensitivity, and the hope for a resolution that preserves the unity of the Church. It was the language of a man who knew he had lost. But the consequences of what Ferrante had built, and what Leo had exposed, were only beginning to unfold. The expanded investigation was still ongoing. The names in that classified document were still being reviewed. More interviews were being scheduled. More records were being examined. And the question that hung over the Vatican like Roman summer heat, heavy, inescapable, pressing down on everything, was still unanswered. Who else? That question is what made every bishop in Rome go quiet. Not fear of the Pope, not fear of punishment, but fear of the answer. Fear that the system they had lived inside for so long, the system they had accepted, accommodated, and in some cases benefited from, was finally being held up to the light, and that the light would not be kind. Because the truth, once it starts moving, doesn't stop for anyone. Not for tradition, not for rank, not for red hats. Pope Leo XIV understood that better than anyone inside those walls. He had said it himself months earlier, during his first extraordinary consistory in January, standing before the assembled College of Cardinals, 170 of them gathered from around the world. He had delivered a single sentence without notes, looking directly into the faces of men who had spent their entire careers navigating the quiet politics of the institutional church. This church will not be governed by silence anymore. At the time, some dismissed it as rhetoric, a new pope finding his voice, an American learning the theatre of the Vatican. But looking back now after the SSPX excommunication, after the Ferrante removal, after the financial reforms and the governance restructuring and the relentless, methodical dismantling of everything that no longer served the mission of the Church, those words were not rhetoric. They were a promise. And on the night of June 30th, 2026, when a single envelope was placed on a desk inside a Vatican residence, that promise was kept. The red hat was taken back. And every bishop in Rome understood, with absolute, undeniable clarity, that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. If this story moved you, take a moment right now to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Every like and every share helps more people find these stories that the world needs to know. Stay with us because what happens next inside the Vatican may be even more extraordinary than what you just heard.